Good morning, good morning. It is a pleasure to have you here with me today. This is the lovely podcast, The Endurance of Labor Laws. I am your lovely host, Lesley Sullivan. And let's go ahead and get started. This is episode 18. And today we're going to take a look at the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. And I'm looking at their symbol and it looks really cool. It almost reminds me of the Masons, which is a semi-religious / non-religious organization. They just have their own way of doing things, but the Masons, from what I understand, at least in Oklahoma, they are not necessarily a union. But we'll take a look at that later in time. But for today, we're going to be talking about the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. So let's start with the facts. Just a few key points here. It says it was founded in 1888. They are headquartered in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, in the United States. They have locations in the United States and Canada. As of 2013, they have a little over 570,000 members. Their international president is Robert Martinez Jr., and they are affiliated with AFL, CIO, CLC, ITF, IMF, and IFBWW, which I'm not sure what that is, so I'll take a look at that later in time. But let's go ahead and dive into this one. It says the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers is an AFL-CIO CLC trade union representing approximately 646,933 workers as of 2006 in more than 200 industries, with most of its membership in the United States and Canada. Right there, that concerns me that this is an international union, because when it lists the international president, that immediately tells me that this union is within several countries, at least two. So this is going to be the United States and Canada. And as previously mentioned in a podcast, it's not good business for unions to be connected to other countries with their union, because your monies will be taken out of your country and sent elsewhere. Basically, the United States will become the piggy bank of whoever they're doing business with, because the United States is more prosperous and more numerous in terms of monies and peoples than Canada and some other countries that are involved in unions. It goes on to say, on May 5th, 1888, Thomas W. Talbot, a railroad machinist in Atlanta, Georgia, founded the Order of United Machinists and Mechanical Engineers. Talbot and 18 others had been members in the Knights of Labor. Talbot believed that a union needed to be formed for railroad machinists that would resist wage cuts. He wanted to provide insurance against unemployment, illness, and accidents, but also wanted railroad machinists to be recognized for their craft skill. Unlike the Knights of Labor, who accepted everyone, Talbot's union accepted only white U.S. citizens, preferably native-born. Well, that's pretty discrimination right there. It says the union excluded blacks, women, non-citizens, and had secret passwords. This is starting to remind me of the Masons more and more. Now I understand why this is triggering a memory here. It says, despite the secrecy, the order spread beyond Georgia, thanks in part to boomers, men who traveled the railway lines for work. These boomers established local lodges in new areas. Oh, lodges. Okay, so I wonder if this guy was a Mason, because, first of all, the symbol that it looks there, and also they don't use the word locals, they use the word lodges. Masons do. Because we have a Masons Lodge in one of my hometowns here in Oklahoma, and I tell you what, getting in that place was like trying to get into Fort Knox. And their original lodge, the one I remember as a little kid, it was amazing to walk in there. I mean, it felt like you were walking into a cult, because of the strange symbols they had on the walls, the strange phrases they had on the walls. It was really weird. It was not normal, and they typically did not allow people in there, but they had a pool and they had swimming lessons there. So sometimes the kids would go inside the Masons Lodge, to go use the bathroom, to change clothes, whatever the case may be. And of course, us being little kids, we're going to snoop, right? And we saw the strangest things ever. It was just a really interesting place. It looked like almost like a museum, but kind of a creepy museum. And I was like, this is taking place in our town? It was a little strange. So then it goes on to say, within 1 year, there were 40 lodges, and by 1891, there were 189. On May 6, 1889, the Machinists held their first major convention in Atlanta. Talbot was elected the Grand Master Machinist. Okay, this is ringing another bell. Okay, so It says here that he was, in the previous paragraph it said that he was in the Knights of Labor. When you have a knight, that reminds me of some of these different religious organizations and some cults as well, that the men are called knights and the women are called ladies, if they even allow ladies in their organization, which in this one they did not. But whenever they have a head honcho, someone that's in charge of these religious organizations or these cults, they call them the Grand Master. So this is starting to definitely remind me of the Masons. So it says Talbot was elected the Grand Master Machinist, later known as International President. So there they changed the title from Grand Master to International President. And I bet it's because they were no longer willing to operate as a Mason Lodge, would be my guess. And then it says, and William L. Dowley was elected as Grand Secretary, now known as General Secretary Treasurer. The organization's name was changed to the National Association of Machinists, and a constitution was drawn up. Okay, now I'm not surprised by that. So I bet what happened was this was started by a bunch of Masons. And Masons do not function the same way as a normal, how do I want to word this, a normal organization that has a constitution and has a treasurer, because if you notice, the job titles changed, and they actually drafted a constitution. When you are in the Masons organization, there's not necessarily a constitution. There's a way of belief, and you either accept that belief or you're not in it, and you are excluded. And you have rights and initiation rights, almost like when you're joining, the Catholic Church, or if you're joining a fraternity, things like that. They have these ceremonies that they go through with secret passwords, secret handshakes, all this stuff, and it's very much cult-like with the Masons. So I'm not surprised that in order for this organization to grow and stay around, it had to do away with whatever they were doing previously and switch over to just being a normal organization that's not affiliated with any kind of cult, not affiliated with any kind of religion, and kind of be more streamlined in terms of businesses and operate it in a business-like manner, not a cult or religious-like manner. That is what this is telling me here. And I'll come back to a story about the Masons here in a little bit because of what my experience was with it. It says here the organization's name was changed to the National Association of Machinists, and a constitution was drawn up. The NAM began publishing the 16-page Machinist Monthly Journal. Also in 1889, Frank French designed an emblem for the Union. The emblem consisted of a flywheel, a friction joint caliper, and a machinist square with the initials of the organization. According to French, the flywheel represented the ongoing power of the Union once it started, and the caliper signified an extended invitation to all persons of civilized countries. Well, right there we're seeing that there was definitely a shift and a change within the organization, because initially they were only wanting citizens that were white and that were native born and that were men. It goes on to say, side note, you have to remember that women could not vote at this time. So that's another reason why women were discriminated against, was because they were seen as property, and they were also viewed, and this is even in the United States. So for those that are listening to this, that maybe your history classes excluded certain parts of history of the United States, or maybe you're listening from another country. The United States, we are a good country, but we've come a long way. And I say that respectfully to my country, but you have to remember during this time, women could not vote. They could not hardly own property, and the reason why was because they were not seen as equal citizens to men. And if they did own a business and if they married, all their property and their monies went to their husband. It was very difficult for them to have any kind of money because they still had this dowry kind of system. And in case you're not familiar with the dowry system, let's say we're back in the 1800s. I'm a woman, so let's say you're a man listening to this, and let's say you ask me to marry you. Well, during this time, it was very rare for a woman to just say yes on her own. You had to go through her family. And also, she did not really have a say in much. So it was between you, your parents, and her father, not her mother. Her mother probably kept her mouth shut. But what would happen in this kind of situation would be, you would address my dad. Our mothers would not really have anything to say, because our mothers would not be treated like they had a brain. They'd be treated like morons. And women during this time were treated as property, so they were used for sex, popping out babies, cooking in the kitchen, and also they were used for money. not necessarily prostitution, but this is different. When you have a dowry system, it's where if you wanted to marry me during this time, my dad would give you a set amount of money because you're basically buying me because I'm seen as a burden, because now you're going to have me in your house. You're going to have to provide for me, because women did not work the same kind of jobs during these days. Because back in these days, 1800s and also early 1900s, if a woman had to work, she was considered a lower class citizen, even though she didn't have the same citizenship as a man. Women, how do I word this? The only way that you were considered a prosperous or a good woman to marry was if you came from a good family, and if you had a lot of money, and that you did not have to work for a living. Because if the woman had to work, that was a indicator that the family was poor and they were not doing well and the husband was not doing well. So if you were to marry me, my dad would give you a whole bunch of money because you're taking me on as a burden. And so that way, whatever I cost you financially for our lifetime, the dowry that my dad would give you would cover the cost of that. So it's very important to remember that there's a reason why certain people were not allowed into unions like this. And there's a reason why people were not allowed into secret organizations, which is what the Masons were. And, we may not understand that history, but, the United States, I'm trying to think how to describe this, because I'm thinking about all the history that I have in my head that we were actually taught as kids, because there's a lot of history that is not being taught about the United States. But see, here's the thing. When our founding fathers came over here to the United States, I know this is going back, from this time frame back well over 200 years, but here's the thing. A lot of people came to the United States because they didn't like the system they were living in. However, they still had to establish a system here that was the least tyrannical, but they created a system that they were still familiar with, because they weren't always sure what system to switch to, because it's one of those things. If you're leaving a monarchy that is trying to kill you because you're Catholic or you're not Catholic or you're Buddhist or whatever, or whatever religion you might be, if you're leaving a monarchy, you're not only leaving a monarchy, you're leaving your way of life. You're leaving your trade. So when all these people, all these immigrants came to the United States, they basically had to start from the ground up, but all they knew was what they knew previously in their life. So that's why we had some of these stigmas that were practiced in the United States. That doesn't mean it was only founded in the United States, or that's the only place you could find it. These stigmas and these ways of thinking came from Europe, came from other areas. But unfortunately, sometimes it takes time to get people to move forward. But the great thing about the United States is that everybody wanted to move forward. But it's not like flipping a switch. So when the founding fathers and all these immigrants came over here and they founded the United States, there was no way they could found the United States and say, okay, we're not going to have a king, we're not going to have a queen, women are going to be seen as equals. Whenever women marry, you're not going to get a bunch of money out of their family. We're going to have blacks and whites be equal. We're going to have Asians be equal. We're going to have the Irish and the Scots be equal to everybody. Like, there was no way this country could have been founded with all those things I just said, because not everybody agreed with all those things. Everybody wanted to move forward, but the number one thing that they were running away from was from tyranny, from being executed. So they had to look at things differently, and they had to start a country somewhere. Meaning they had to found it on freedom and religious liberty, because if you don't start with the basic, then you can't push forward to these other things. So, when you're looking at history like this historical data about this particular union, I would agree with you that this union was not founded for the best intentions. There was discrimination. There was a horrible way of viewing other people. It was very discriminatory. It was very cult-like a little bit, because that's what it reminds me of. But that doesn't mean that it didn't eventually move forward, and in fact, it moved forward very quickly in changing its way of thinking, because it was founded in 1888, and then they start changing things within like 3 or 4 years. So obviously, a person who's kind of stuck in one way can found a good organization, and then once they kind of wake up to, oh, we can't operate like this, because first of all, this is not how our country operates. And we're not really going to be able to help our neighbor and to help each other if we don't include other people. So what I'm saying is that, they're very narrow-minded people that they can start an organization one way, but it can actually grow into something better, because what this shows me here, and mind you, I'm not the biggest fan of unions anymore, but in terms of history, in terms of historical data, which is how my brain look at things because I've worked as an auditor and a staff accountant, when I see that there's a shift towards the good, that tells me that they're willing to change, and they're willing to change for the better. And that's what makes the United States unique, and that's what makes our labor force unique, is that even though the United States has its issues, it has its problems, we are no different than any other country or nation in that respect. But what makes us one of the best places to be, and what makes us number one in so many respects, is the fact that we continue to grow towards the common good. That doesn't mean socialized medicine, that doesn't mean liberalism, that doesn't mean extreme conservatism. It just means that as a country, as a nation, we address issues as they come up, and we are willing to make things better. We're not going to stay stuck in the past, and we're going to push forward towards better days. And that's what we're seeing here. When they started out one way in 1888, but then just within 3 to 4 years, they are already, going past and moving past their founding of thinking, oh, we're going to practice discrimination. But here's the thing. Whenever someone is practicing discrimination, they're not going, oh, yeah, I practice discrimination. Yeah, I hate certain people. I don't like certain people. They don't talk or think that way about themselves, because they have a mindset of what is considered acceptable to them. However, it's obvious that their mindset is already changing, because you have to remember that this kind of work that you're talking about with machinists and railroad workers and things like that, that was the grunt work of the United States. Those were not the cushy aerospace jobs. Those were not the desk jobs. The only desk jobs that were available back then were bankers and Wall Street people, and those were really the only two. Everybody else was pretty much blue-collar workers. So in order for this union to grow, I bet they had to expand their base and expand it to different types of members in society, because one of the biggest things about the United States is that we are a melting pot. Like, I'm Irish and French. Those are my, that's my ancestry. So if you're only going to pick one type of people, one group of people, especially when your country is fairly young, you're going to have a hard time continuing to be a country. You're going to have a hard time growing into a country and being a better country. Because if you don't grow, you're going to be very isolated. And I think that's what happened here, because if you remember, as of 2013, they have a little over 570,000 members. So obviously, they started out with maybe a handful, and then now they've grown to that number. There's no way they would have grown to over 570,000 members if they had not changed along the way and gotten better at what they wanted and what they wanted to do and what they wanted to accomplish within the United States. So it's important that you focus on what's around you first. It's kind of like what Joel Osteen says, and I love his ministry, I love his podcast, I love his sermons. He's absolutely wonderful. What he said is, you need to bloom where you're planted. Do good where God puts you. Because one of the biggest things that you can do in terms of a mistake is to not do good things where you are currently. Because if all you focus on is what you don't like, then that's all you're going to get is what you don't like. So what I do like about what this guy did, Thomas Talbot, he noticed that there needed to be some changes within the industry. So instead of being miserable about it and being negative about it, he took the initiative and he wanted things to be better for a very particular group of people. But then very quickly it grew into, hey, we're going to expand this and include other people in this union, and we're going to grow our organization, because railroad workers, I don't know how many people are aware of this, especially outside the United States, but some of our railroad workers were built by foreigners. You had the Irish, and you had Chinese. I don't think we had any Japanese or Vietnamese, but we had quite a few Chinese workers and Asian workers in general that were brought over here. And that's how some of these Asian districts were started in the United States, was because they had their foundings near the railroads, because they were the ones that built our railroads in the United States. And then you had these cities that just popped up overnight, because now you've got this huge influx of people coming here from other countries to build these railroads, build these modes of transportation, and then they may not have the opportunity to go back to their homeland, or they may not want to go back because they realize, hey, the United States is far better than where I came from. I have a better future here. It may have started out rough, in a very, laborious position, but I have more rights here, I have more freedom here. That's how a lot of people came to the United States. What a lot of people don't realize is that the majority of people that came to the United States were poor. Whether it was at our founding or even all along these years since then, most people that come here were not super wealthy, because if you were super wealthy, let's go back in time, if you were super wealthy and you lived in Britain or France, why would you leave your country? Because if you were super wealthy back in those days, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, if you were super wealthy in France, Britain, some of these other countries over there in Europe, that meant that you had a title. And if to leave your country would be to sacrifice your title, you would be sacrificing your land, you would be sacrificing ownership. So most of the people, the majority of people, they came over here with nothing. They only came over here probably with the clothes on their back, a few dollars in their pocket, and their good name. But most people that came over here did not have wealth, they did not have titles. So a lot of these people came over here knowing that they were going to have to work, and they wanted to work because they knew that their labor was valuable. Whereas in their homeland and their countries in Great Britain or France or some of these other European countries, their labor was not seen as equal to the landowner or to the person that was over them. It was almost like they were always an indentured servant or slave, or they were always going to be a peasant, because that was the social structure over there in Europe. So a lot of these poor people came over to America knowing full well we didn't have that. We didn't have that type of social structure. Now, in the very beginnings, before the United States became a country, when other countries and monarchies had colonies here in the United States, there was slavery. There was indentured servants and slaves, and the indentured servants were mostly whites from England and Britain, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, because there was a white slave trade, and they knew that if they could come over here and work 7 years as an indentured servant, they could earn their freedom. Whereas in Britain and some of those other countries, it was like if they stayed there, they could never earn their freedom. So that's why so many people came over here with absolutely nothing, and then eventually they became citizens. So they made sacrifices to come over here, and they already knew that they were going to have a better life anyway. So that's kind of just a backstory of some of the stuff that you're seeing here, and why during the 1800s, probably why this was founded and the way that they were thinking and their mindset, because of you have to think in terms of, when you're looking back in time in society, you have to remember what country you're looking at, what was the social structure at the time, what was the religiosity at the time, and what were the standards of the workforce at that time. Like, all these things make up the social structure of a country that directly affects these people's lives. So when you're looking, for example, at Thomas W. Talbot, who started this and founded this particular union, you have to remember that this is maybe 20 years, no, this would be, a little over 20 years after the Civil War. So you have to remember that that was probably still fresh in the mind of a lot of people. A lot of people. And this was a machinist in Atlanta, Georgia, so the South. So look at that. Look at that avenue of knowledge as well, because there's a reason why he only wanted whites in this union, because he's in the South. And even though the Civil War ended, slavery was over, there was still segregation back then. Like, segregation did not even completely end even a little bit past the 1960s. So, even though segregation is wrong, and a lot of people were against it, it was still taking place even back then. But over time, our country moved forward. So it's important that when you're looking at historical data, don't get pissed off. Don't get so focused on one particular thing and be like, oh, look, there's slavery again. No. You have to understand what was considered normal back then. What was the normalcy? It was not uncommon for men back then in Georgia to think that way about blacks. It also was not uncommon for them to view Asians that way, or Mexicans. Basically, if you weren't white, they really didn't want you there. But also, they had just, they're coming out of a civil war, and they're recovering their land. They're trying to get an industry back, because you have to remember, from my previous podcast with this, that the South suffered tremendously during the Civil War and after the Civil War. And the effects of that war they affected the South, their economy for a long, long time. I don't know if they actually ever fully recovered, because the South was a very prosperous area to live in before the Civil War. So when you had the Civil War happen, and then even after the Civil War, the South is trying to grasp what's going on. They're trying to earn a living. They have families. They have mouths to feed. They're trying to earn a living. They're trying to get back to some sort of normalcy. But if you think about it, they lost their way of life. And so even just 20 to 30 years after the Civil War, that's not very long to try and transition into something new. It takes time. So just take into consideration all these factors that make up this person's life, these people's lives, our country's history, the history of that area, and why people thought the way they did. Because it makes a difference in why they founded stuff and how things changed over time. And yes or no as to why something stood the test of time and continued to stick around. So I bring that up because that's what it makes me think of when I see some of these things, because it's one of those things, if you don't have the history knowledge to understand their way of life, then you're not going to understand why they did what they did. You're not going to understand their way of thinking and why they set up the rules that they had. But even so, their rules changed as our country changed. The United States changed drastically in the 1800s. There were so many things that happened, not even including the Civil War. There were so many things that occurred in that century. And all those things affected, if you look at it this way, it affected our ancestors and affected our way of life. So just take that into consideration and look at it as an opportunity to learn more about your country and to learn about an industry that you may not have ever heard about before. Because I personally don't know much about machinists these days, but I do know a lot about the railroads because I had to study it back in middle school for a paper. And I remember reading about all these immigrants that came over here, because when, back in middle school, you're like 12, 13, 14 years old. When I thought of immigrants, I just really thought of the Irish that came over to Ellis Island. And then also I thought of the immigrants that came over before the founding of our country, with our founding fathers and things like that. It never dawned on me about these people here. So you have to really look at the whole picture, because if you don't look at the whole picture, then you're denying the fact that these people were alive and that they, what they did was good for our country, even if we don't agree with it. Because sometimes the way that things get better is when you make a mistake. And I think this organization realized they made a mistake by excluding blacks, excluding women, excluding this and that. I think they realized that, hey, we can't act like that and expect our organization to be seen as a good organization. And we also cannot move forward in helping people in our area, in our neighborhoods, our society, in our community, if we continue to think that way. We have to open up our hearts to other people, and I think that's what they did here. I wasn't around at that time, but just looking back and what I know about historical data and this area with the South, because my family's from the South, my ancestors are, I understand why they think I understand why they thought the way they thought. But I also understand why they changed, because their society was changing, their economy was changing. So it's like, if you don't change with it, it's going to be very difficult to be successful. So it goes on to say, in 1890 and 1891, NAM reached Canada, making Canadians the first international members. locals were also formed in Mexico. I'm surprised by that. To reflect this, in 1891, the name was changed from National Association of Machinists to International Association of Machinists at a conference in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, the reason why I'm surprised that this spread to Mexico is because that Mexico has been a corrupt country for a long time. Let me get a drink of water. Hold on just a moment. Okay, I'm back. I'm surprised that locals were formed in Mexico because Mexico has had a very turbulent history as well. It's actually a very corrupt country. There's so many things that we don't hear about. But even to this day, they still have problems with gang violence. They still have problems in towns, not necessarily the same as in cities, but in towns in the more rural areas, there are certain families or groups of people or gangs that are in charge of those towns, and you have to pay them off. It's kind of like almost like the Italian mafia, where you pay them off to basically protect the neighborhood. Otherwise, they're not going to protect you, and they will purposely ruin your business or kill you or kidnap your family, hold you hostage, and things like that. And you know, their labor force is very much different in Mexico than they are in the United States. And an example of that would be with Nabisco, you know, the people that make crackers here in the United States. Of course, they no longer do that here in the United States. But, you know, when Nabisco had more factories and bakeries here in the United States, you know, their products were really good. And I know several years ago that the quality of their food went down, and it was starting to make me feel sick. Like I noticed, like when I ate some of their crackers, it inflamed my eczema. Like I had a autoimmune reaction to some of their foods. And then I look at the label and I realize that now they're including bioengineered ingredients, and I know exactly why my system was reacting to that. So I no longer eat those foods. But what I noticed was that the reason why those ingredients have been added, one of the reasons is because Nabisco, they sold out, I think they're one of the companies I'm thinking of, Mendelez, if I'm not mistaken, which is a big conglomerate. They don't really care about quality of food. It's just basically a huge type of Wall Street company that buys up all these companies and then outsources the labor to cheap countries like Mexico that has really bad labor laws. They don't really protect their workers, and it's cheap labor. So Nabisco, they sold out to Mendelez, if I'm not mistaken, and then our factories were closed here in terms of bakeries, so a lot of those people lost their jobs here in the United States. Those jobs were then sent to Mexico, and then the quality of the goods went down, and they started utilizing bioengineered ingredients because it was cheaper to use fake ingredients than to use real ingredients. And then that's when the quality of the goods went down. And, you know, their working conditions are by far not as good or healthy as the ones in the United States. So that's why I'm surprised any locals or any unions were allowed into Mexico. And also, way back in the day, Mexico had a couple revolutions. So it's one of those things that it's not good to have your union be in other countries like that, because you're taking on a huge risk, financial risk, with that, because if they don't practice the same kind of labor laws as what is taking place in your country, you're going to have a very hard time protecting your workers in the same way. You're going to have a very hard time in getting the same type of labor. You're going to have a very hard time getting the same type of wages. And you're also going to take a huge risk of not producing the same kind of goods, but yet your good name is associated with the goods that you are producing, but yet the goods may not be the same, and they may be inferior or not have the same kind of quality, which is what has happened with Nabisco. So, kind of a side note there, but, you know, when you think of Mexico, they're not known for, in terms of labor and their economy, it's not as good as the United States. If anything, they have a lot of crime. They have a lot of violence. Like, I remember when I was working at this one office many years ago, there were some people I worked with, they loved going to Cancun or going to Mexico or wherever, and, you know, just really far down into Mexico, different places. And this one lady I knew, her trip got canceled by I think the State Department or Homeland Security or somebody, because there was a travel warning that Americans could not go to this one particular resort area in Mexico because there were Americans that went down there, and their very fancy bus was stopped on the way to the resort or on the way from the resort to the airport, and it was stopped by these gang thugs in Mexico, and they were escorted off or forced off their bus. They were put in a ditch and shot in the head, every single one of them. They were brutally murdered by this gang. And, the State Department issued a warning that, if you have plane tickets or you have reservations to this area, you cannot go. It's not safe for Americans. And, that's within our lifetime that this took place. And it's really interesting because you'll have spikes in violence, and then it'll go down, and you'll have another spike of violence in Mexico, and it goes up and down, up and down. And it's almost always related to corruption. Another problem with Mexico is their local officials, in terms of their government officials, are typically pretty corrupt. And they pretty much have the police departments in their back pocket. And it has to do with money, corruption, power, fraud, embezzlement, all these really horrible things, but at a much greater scale, on a much higher scale than what we experience here. The United States is not perfect, but we by far are nothing like Mexico. We do not have those kind of problems, so I'm surprised that they, even back then, in the 1800s or even 1900s, I'm surprised that we would branch out to Mexico because their way of life is so different compared to our way of life. And their goods are different and their market is different. So it's just one of those things. You have to be careful who you do business with, because whoever you do business with could possibly ruin your good name. So just remember that going forward in all things. In any kind of business transaction, it doesn't matter if you're on an international stage, a national stage, a domestic stage, or if you're in your hometown, in your local community, or even if you're just doing business with someone that is repairing your roof. Let's say that you have roofers installing a new roof. Well, if you just went with whoever and you didn't really investigate them and they have really bad labor practices, but you didn't take the due diligence to look into this company, but yet you're employing them, then you basically are saying that you're okay with their practices, even if you didn't know about their practices. But you just have to be careful who you do business with. Because whoever you do business with is a direct reflection of you, your character, your choices, and your decisions as a person and as a business professional. It doesn't matter if you're a millionaire, billionaire, or if you only have $2 in your bank account. You are a business professional, and everything you say and do matters big time, because it's a direct reflection of you and your good name. So it goes on to say, in 1892, IAM signed a contract with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. I'm not surprised by that because of the railroad systems, establishing the first organized stop at a railroad in the United States. Because IAM had a color bar, that's interesting, the American Federation of Labor did not accept IMA right away. Okay, I had never heard it put that way, but that's kind of harsh. After IAM finally did join AFL President Samuel Gompers urged IAM to drop its whites-only rule. Good, I agree with that. But IAM maintained racial segregation, arguing that it needed to retain Southern members. That goes into that South mentality a little bit. IAM Chief Talbot wanted the Union to be a fraternity of white men. See the word fraternity? That reminds me of the Masons Lodge, because they view themselves as a fraternity. Wanted the Union to be a fraternity of white men born in the United States who possessed good moral character. Though the AFL president urged the dropping of the color bar, member unions routinely discriminate against black workers through racial exclusion policies on the local level, which the AFL rarely commented on. Let me get a drink of water. Okay, moving on. It says the Machinist membership reached 300,000 during World War I, which at the time made it the largest union in 1918. As the war ended and wartime production came to an end, membership dropped to 80,000 in 1923. Now what that tells me right there, because you're going from 300,000 down to 80,000, that is a huge drop. So what that tells me is that the wartime production did not transition over to industrialization, and also we're creeping into the Great Depression, the stock market crash, and also the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl affected Oklahoma really bad. We'll possibly talk about that in a later podcast. But again, take into consideration what was going on at that time in the teens, the 20s, and the 30s. And see, here's the thing: like, we know the Great Depression happened, primarily in the 30s, but it's kind of one of those things, sometimes you have a definitive start date and sometimes you don't. Like the Great Depression, let's say, for example, it started in 1932. I'm just making up a year. But that doesn't mean that you just flipped a switch and all of a sudden, oh, Great Depression, 1932, this is what we're living in. No. Things like that, they take time to build. So I'm using this as a completely false date, but let's say the Great Depression started in 1932. The effects of it were felt way before then, possibly 5 to 10 years prior. Because in order for your stock market to crash and to be that bad, you had to have several systems fail in order for it to get that bad. It didn't just happen overnight. There were several things that took a toll, and eventually it affected the entire United States. That's why you had the Federal Trade Commission and some other commissions created to help guard and protect our stock markets, our economy, and the U.S. dollar, our currency, so that way this kind of depression would never happen again. So sometimes there is a reason why government agencies are created. Other times there is no good reason for them to be created. But in terms of catastrophes like this that happened in our history, it was very important for the federal government to intervene and say, hey, we need to try and prevent this as much as possible because this caused a really high rate of starvation and unemployment, and the United States cannot suffer from that again. We are too large of a country to endure that, so there were some things that were changed in terms of the economy and our market during and after the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and some other things that happened as well, which all this was pre-World War II. So then it goes on to say, membership declined in 1933 to only 50,000 due to the effects of the Great Depression. Of those 50,000 members, 23,000 workers were unemployed. That is an extremely high rate right there. In 1935, the Machinists started to organize with the airline industry. I did not know that. In 1936, the Boeing Company in Seattle, Washington, signed industry's first labor agreement. Oh, that's neat. I like Boeing. They're a really good company. I've met some people that work for them. They're really good people. They have a really good product as well. And they treat their employees really well. By 1938, the IAM negotiated the first union agreement in air transportation with Eastern Airlines. I just thought of, it might be really interesting to continue this podcast and look up different industries specifically. Like, for example, I never had heard of Eastern Airlines, so it might be interesting to look up all the airlines that ever existed in the United States and just learn about that, because those were people that started a company. You had workers that worked for these companies. And, who knows, maybe my ancestors or your ancestors flew on these airlines. I mean, it definitely was a mode of transportation. It goes on to say in 1944, IAM union members established an education department to publish a supplemental journal. This journal would be published weekly by the Machinist, the IAM newspaper. Eventually, the journal's production was cut back to twice a year and was voted out of existence in 1956. It was replaced with a quarterly magazine entitled the IAMW Journal. Okay, so moving on, it says, the break was over a failure of AFL to settle a jurisdictional dispute between IAM and the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America, as well as the Amalgamated Association of Street and Electric Railway Employees of America. IAM disaffiliated with the AFL in 1945. In 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, officially known as the Labor Management Relations Act, which placed restrictions on union activities. This act also contained provisions that made closed shops illegal and outlawed boycotts. The second section of the Taft-Hartley Act was controversial because it allowed states to pass right-to-work laws. Ooh, okay. All right, that rings it's raising a red flag in my brain. Okay. Which enabled them to regulate the number of union shops. Furthermore, the Machinists worked with AFL unions to repeal the act. The limitations imposed on union political activity by this act led to the creation of the Machinist Nonpartisan Political League. So here you see a union that is directly reacting to legislation that has been passed. And I just pray that they are not being infiltrated by communists, because whenever you have a union that is reacting like this, and they're like, well, if you're going to do this legislation-wise, we're just going to create our own league, our own group. I just pray that it's not to deal with any fascism or communism, because that is very detrimental to any country, not just the United States. So it goes on to say in 1948, Lodge 751 went on strike against the Boeing Company in Seattle, Washington. The Machinists preserved long-standing seniority rules that the company wanted to abolish and achieved a 10% per hour raise. IAM also competed for members with the United Auto Workers of America. Ooh, I bet that was interesting. In the automotive industry and with the United Aerospace Workers for aircraft working in that union. In 1949, IAM signed no rating agreements with both unions. These agreements became the model for other unions when AFL and the CIO merged in 1955. I'm surprised AFL and CIO merged. That is very interesting. Because I would want to kind of get the history to that, because it always kind of surprises me whenever these entities merge, and then it's almost like they merge and then disaffiliate. It's almost like a marriage that doesn't really work, is kind of what it reminds me of. And I'm not against marriage. I think marriage is a beautiful, wonderful thing, but I've noticed that when there are some people, when they're married, when they're not a good match and they have a long time of trying to figure that out, but they keep going back to each other. That's what it reminds me of when they disaffiliate, then come back together. They disaffiliate, then come back together. So, kind of one of those things. So then it goes on to say the 1950s was a period of rapid growth for IAM. The production of jet engines during the war led IAM to expand to the aircraft industry. Oh, that would be why they had that. Okay, that makes more sense. By 1958, IAM had more than 900,000 members. Wow. This was because IAM took steps to begin to move away from its racist past. That's good. In 1955, under the leadership of President Al Hayes, IAM became more of an industrial union. It began to shift from railroad work to metal fabrication. Now, one of the reasons why that happened is because railroads, they were a mode of transportation, but they were losing out to the automobile. And during this time, highways, our infrastructure was starting to be built more on a massive scale. So you had less people using railroads and more people purchasing vehicles. You also had the automobile industry that was making cars more accessible to the consumer, meaning to the middle class and lower class income brackets, whereas before automobiles were considered truly a luxury item that could only be purchased by the wealthy. So you have some changes here in the economy. You have some changes as well within the family. The American family was becoming a nuclear family, like in the 1950s and pushing forward. And typically that meant one man, one woman, and maybe 2 or 3 kids, but usually not more than that, because in the 1950s was when you had the introduction of birth control pills. So there are a lot of things that overlap and take place during this time frame. So goes on to say IAM had more union members as well as workers in the aircraft industry. Thus, aerospace workers were attracted to join IAM. The trade union produced a first-of-its-kind radio show, Boomer Jones, to tell their history in a modern way. In 1964, IAM changed its name to the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. IAMAW began to strike against 5 major airlines, including Eastern, National, Northwest, Trans World, and United Airlines. Of all the airlines I just mentioned there, the only one that I recognize is United, so it might be interesting to look up these other airlines. It says here 35,400 IAMAW members in 231 cities grounded the airlines for 43 days, finally winning 5% raises in 3 successive years. IAM membership nearly doubled in the 1950s, in large part due to the, what is that? I don't know what this word is, but I'm guessing the booming airline industry, from 500,000 members in 1949 to 900,000 members in 1958. As a result of the influx of members from the airlines and the new American space program, the delegates voted to change the name to the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers at the 1964 convention. In 1982, due to individual and corporate bankruptcies, IAM membership dropped to 820,000 members from a high of 927,000 in 1973. Also in 1982, boycott was initiated by IAM against Brown & Sharp, a machine precision measuring and cutting tool manufacturer headquartered in Rhode Island. The boycott was called after the firm refused to bargain in good faith, withdrawing previously negotiated clauses in the contract, and forced the union into a strike, during which police sprayed pepper gas on some 800 picketers at the company's North Kingston plant in early 1982. 3 weeks later, a machinist narrowly escaped serious injury when a shot fired into the picket line hit his belt buckle. The National Labor Relations Board later charged Sharp and Brown with, regressive bargaining. Oh, now I understand. Regressive bargaining, and of entering into negotiations with the express purpose of not reaching an agreement with the union. That's not a very pleasant thing to do. It was not until 1998, nearly 17 years after the strike began, that the Rhode Island Supreme Court ended the legal battle, ultimately siding with Brown and Sharp in its plea that it had not illegally forced the strike. By this point, both Brown and Sharp and its something, I don't know what that word is, its workforce were retreating from manufacturing in Rhode Island. That's what I figured was going to happen, because when you have a strike that lasts that long and you can't work things out, more than likely your industry is going to leave your state. And Rhode Island is not a very large state anyway, so I can't imagine industry staying there very long with that. Because Rhode Island's not known for being successful in that regards. From 1981 to 1990, the union owned and operated an Indy car racing team, Machinist Union Racing. On September 7, 2008, the union began a strike against Boeing over issues with outsourcing, job security, pay, and benefits. The Transportation Corporations International Union merged with the IAM after a TCU member vote in July 2005. The union continues to expand into different companies today. In December 2013, the union's attempt to represent workers represent workers at an Amazon.com fulfillment center in Middletown, Delaware, failed. Wow, okay. Because when I saw the words Amazon, I stuttered. I was like, whoa, Amazon. In 2020, the union began a strike at Bath Iron Works, a major shipyard in Bath, Maine, over disagreements regarding a new labor contract with the company. The strike, occurring during the COVID-19 pandemic, was described by the IAM president as the largest strike in the United States of America right now. Well, that's kind of a BS line, because it's like, you're going through a pandemic. Of course it's going to look like the largest strike, because no one's really working. Like, I just kind of think that's arrogant and stupid to say that, because our country really suffered during 2020 with the pandemic. And here he is trying to make it about the union. I just think that's so wrong, especially when so many people died from COVID. I think that's really cruel. The strike ended after 2 months, with new labor contract agreements viewed as favorable to the union members. Goes on to say, according to IAM's Department of Labor records since 2005, when membership classifications were first reported, the union's membership has been generally in a slow decline, including dues paying, retired, and exempt members. Despite this Life Members Report, a 22% increase during this period, and unemployed members momentarily increased to a peak in 2009 before also declining. Members classified as on strike have varied considerably throughout, though remaining less than 1% of the total membership. IAM contracts also cover some non-members known as agency fee payers, which since 2005 have grown to number comparatively just over 1% of the size of the union's membership. As of 2013, this accounts for about 145,000 retirees, 52,000 life members, 26,000 exempt members, and 14,000 unemployed members, plus about 7,000 non-members paying agency fees, compared to about 333,000 dues-paying members, which is about 58%. And then it goes over their presidents. Some of them are international. What I wanted to go back and talk about was the Masons Lodge. So let me get a drink of water, because my throat is really dry. Hold on just a second. Okay, I am back. So I clicked on Thomas W. Talbot to get a little bit of his history. It doesn't mention anything to do with the Masons Lodge, but I suspect that there is some involvement with that, even though it's not listed here. Just because you have to remember that words matter, and the way that they found stuff really matters. And plus, I bet the reason why there isn't a lot of that information about him is that the Masons are very secretive. And I'll give an example from what happened in my life, but first I want to quote Thomas Talbot here, because I was reading about him. He only lived to be 42. He was murdered. It's really sad. I wasn't expecting to read that about him, but here's a quote from him. He says, "There's dignity in labor that carries with it respect. both the labor of the hands and of the head, providing for our bodily wants, as well as toiling to develop some enterprise of worldwide reputation. So I think that's a wonderful quote. I actually really love that because that's exactly how I view labor. What's interesting is that even though I'm not hugely pro-union per se, there are times I'll be working and there are some people that will ask me, hey, are you in a union? Because you sound like you're in a union, like just the way you talk about labor. And I'm like, you don't have to be in a union to value your labor, which is sad, but it's true. But anyway, the way I came across the Masons was, first of all, there was a Masons Lodge in my hometown. And they're also known as the Shriners. So they have like a Shriners hospital that helps kids recover from cancer, and they do cancer research and things like that. But when I went to college, one of my roommates in the sorority that I was in, she was really weird. And she was my roommate, and there was something going on in her personal life. So she was dating this guy. And I'm not against weird people, but you could tell that what she was raised was screwing her up mentally. And I could tell that she had been raised in a cult. There was just something about her that wasn't right, because the further she got away from her family and the further she got away from her religion, the more normal she was. So that told me, even as a young person, and we were around the same age, like 18, 19 years old or whatever, even at a young age, I could identify what was happening with this. So anyway, she was dating this guy, and I didn't know that her family didn't know that she was dating this guy. I thought they knew that she had a boyfriend. And so what was going on was, she was raised in the Masons, and it is a secret society, and she had this little binder, this little journal that she would write in, and she would hide it from me. It's not like I was looking for it, but it's like she'd write in it and then hide it, write in it, and then she would hide it. I was like, what's the deal? I was like, I'm your roommate, like I'm not going through your stuff. And she goes, you don't understand, I'm in the Masons and we have secret codes, secret passwords, and I can't let you see this. I was like, fine. I was like, I don't care, like I'm not going to go through your stuff. And she goes, no, you don't understand, this is very secret. I was like, okay, fine, but just like, you're creeping me out with your secrecy. Like you disappear for long periods of time, you talk about your boyfriend and you tell me not to talk about him to anybody, and it's like, I don't really know what's going on. Well, then we were having rush, and that's where you're trying to recruit people for your sorority. And so there was a tiff between her and the people that were in charge of rush in our house. Like we had a committee that was in charge of how we were going to do rush for that season. And oh gosh, this is so hard to say, but because of the cult that she was raised in, that she was still trying to participate in, it's like she was trying to live two lives. She was living two separate lifestyles, and it was really hard on her, especially as a young person, because she's trying not to disappoint her family, but she's also trying to be who she wants to be and who she needs to be. She needs to be an individual. Well, the rush week was overlapping when this Masons Lodge wanted her and some other girls to put in their time. They have to basically do some kind of so-called Christian duty, which, sorry, cults are not Christians, so that's just complete oxymoron. But basically what they wanted their young people to do is they wanted her and some other girls to go to this 7-Eleven and pump gas for people like 24 hours or something. It was really weird, to prove their loyalty to the Masons, and to prove their loyalty to their family, and prove their loyalty to this cult. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. They want you to pump gas late at night to prove your loyalty? And she's like, yes, I have to do it. I was like, what? Are you insane? I was like, why would they ask young women to do that? And so it was kind of similar to the Mormons, where the Mormons, in order to marry within the Mormon religion, is as young people, you get sent out 2 by 2 and you go out and do missionary work. And then you do that for 2 years, and then you can come back to your Mormon town or city or whatever, and then find a spouse and get married. But if you haven't put in your 2 years of preaching the gospel, supposedly gospel, which the Book of Mormon is not the gospel, but if you don't put in your 2 years of being a missionary, then you're not considered marriage material. Well, it was the same way with this Mason's Lodge, was that if she didn't do this, these girls were not considered marriable. And what I didn't know was that she was dating someone outside of the Masons cult or whatever, and her family didn't know because her family kept calling the sorority house directly to our phone in our room. And I was like, what do you mean you don't know where so-and-so is? I was like, I was just like, they kept calling, and I kept telling her whenever she would come in the room, I was like, hey, your family is over calling. I was like, I'm sick of this. This is a phone line for both of us. I said, look, I love you as a sister, but I need to know what's going on. I need to know what's going on right now because the sorority house is getting really concerned about your safety because you disappear at night. You're dating this guy who seems really nice, but then you're very secretive about things. I was like, I need to know what's going on, and I just need to know what's going on because it's creeping me out. So she finally tells me that all this stuff about the Masons, and that her family had already picked out a husband for her within the Masons, and that they did not know that she was dating someone outside the Masons. And she was upset with me because her family had called, and they asked me where she was. I was like, well, she's probably with her boyfriend, I don't know, or at the library. I was like, and they're like, boyfriend? I was like, yeah. I was like, we're in college, like, people date. Like, they didn't know that she had a boyfriend. So the reason why this chick was mad at me and thought I was turning on her, which I was not, was that I spilled the beans by accident by saying she had a boyfriend, which she did. It was the truth. But if she had told me all this, I would have just said, hey, let's shut off our phone, or, let's just have an answering machine. Like, I'll cover for you in that respect. I'm not going to lie for you. But, if you had told me everything up front, I would have been like, oh, I'm sorry, you were raised in a cult and you're trying to decide where you need to go and what you need to do in your life. And you've obviously fallen in love with someone that's not a Mason. And if you marry this guy that's not a Mason, you're going to be kicked out of your family and you're going to be kicked out of the Masons. So I just wish she had told me everything because I would have helped to protect her and to help get her away from that cult. But because she didn't tell me everything, I didn't know. So I just knew that something was a little off and a little weird about her. But, it's one of those things, like, sometimes someone can appear weird and strange and abnormal, but then once you hear their story, you're like, oh, they're not weird, they're not strange, they're dealing with this really horrible situation, they feel trapped and they don't know what to do, and they're too scared to talk about because they're fearful of their situation. And because they have fear in that situation, they're applying those same fears to people that could actually help guard and protect them. So she ended up leaving the sorority house because her family threatened to come up to the university and come up to the sorority house and basically kidnap her, is what they threatened to do. And so she ended up leaving with her boyfriend, and I said, just go with him. I was like, normally I'm not in favor of shacking up and things like that, but I was like, your boyfriend that you have is normal, he's kind, he's gentle. I mean, he's not going to lead you astray. I mean, the fact that you fell in love with someone that's not a Mason, I think is a blessing to you. So if it was me, I would go ahead and leave with your boyfriend and just live your life. You're an adult. You're over the age of 18. You're seen as an adult in the eyes of the law. And you have your own life. You have your own Social Security number. I mean, you're supposed to start paying your taxes and, you're working and things like that. You are an individual. So your family can't just suck you dry of your life. Like, that's what cults do. They manipulate your life. They try and force people to do things they would not normally do, and it usually is always the women and the children that suffer the most. And that's what happened to this girl. And so she just up and left right in the middle of rush, because I told her, I said, look, do not go to that gas station and pump gas at night. I was like, I have a feeling that your family and this cult that you're in is just using that as a way to kidnap you. If that's what they're planning on doing, I bet what's going to happen is you're going to show up at that gas station, and the people that are turning against you within this cult, they're going to put you in their car and take off with you, and then we may never see you again. I was like, that really scares me. And she goes, oh, I didn't think about that. I was like, that's what I think they're up to. I was like, I really wish you would go to the police about this, because it definitely warrants a police investigation. But whatever you want to do and whatever you think is best, but you really need to open your eyes to this. So, that's why whenever I hear the word lodge or Grand Master or things like that, those are terms that are used all the time within these cults, within religious organizations, things like that. And it's usually, it has to deal with titles and it has to deal with ceremonies, secret handshakes, secret passwords, and things like that. And it's just, it concerns me just because of what my roommate had to deal with. I mean, she would cry at night. I'd wake up and she would just be bawling. And I'm like, what is going on? And she's like, Lesley, I can't tell you. I'm sorry. She goes, I'm in a secret society. I mean, I'm in the Masons. I can't tell you anything. If I tell you, I could be kicked out. And then if I get kicked out, then my family gets kicked out. So there was all this pressure being put on her. And, but anyway, if you want to look up the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, their symbol very much reminds me of the Masons. That's the first thing I thought of when I saw it. And then just the names that they called each other, were very, similar to that. And I would say that, if you are a Mason listening to this, really please take stock of what you're involved in. Because I have met some Masons over the years that they're really good men, and but it's almost like the lodge comes first before anything else. It comes before their country. It comes before God. It comes before their wife, their kids. And that is so wrong. That's what I don't like about organizations like that. Is that it puts things in disorder, not in order. And, I think it's great the monies that they raise for children and to fight cancer and things like that. But at the same time, just because someone's doing a good deed over here, that doesn't mean we should ignore the problem on the other side. So, but anyway, this is going over a little over an hour, so I will go ahead and end this lovely podcast. Excuse me. And, just so you know that you have to be careful what organizations you join, especially when it comes to unions and especially when it comes to any kind of religious or cult order. You need to be cautious because whatever you align yourself with is what you're going to adapt and live by those type of standards in your life. And sometimes organizations can make it seem like they're good and true, but you have to, it's what I call the proof is in the pudding is what I typically say. Pudding is a really good dessert. It looks good. If it's sitting there and it's a wonderful dessert, but whatever is in that pudding is what makes it the pudding. So just really be aware of what you're joining, what you're participating in, and what you are aligning yourself with. What are you welcoming into your life? Because whatever you are a part of is what you're bringing into your lifestyle. Because sometimes whatever you bring into your life affects your lifestyle and it changes your lifestyle, which then changes the course of your life. So if the course of your life, is going to change, do everything you can to make sure it's the right change and it's going in the right direction and it's positive for you, yourself, your family, your country, your nation, your neighborhood, your community. Make sure it's a positive change and that things aren't slipping through the cracks. And also don't, how do I word this? Like if you have joined an organization and you're constantly having to make excuses for them, oh, they didn't really mean that. That's not what we believe. If you have to make those kinds of statements, then that's a big clue that you are a part of something that's not, it's making you uncomfortable. And it kind of gives you that weird feeling in your gut. That's your conscience speaking to you, letting you know that, hey, you need to re-examine this because yes, they may do these good things over here, but the other stuff, you can't ignore that. So just be careful what you join, and whatever you join, make sure that it's something that you truly believe in, and, read their constitution, or their manifesto, whatever word that they use, which if they use manifesto, that would be concerning, but, really read their laws and bylaws of how they operate and how they function, because that will tell you the course of the organization, and that will let you know really how your life is going to be involved in that organization, how that organization is going to be involved in your life, because it's not just your professional career that's affected, it's your daily life that's affected, it's your personal life that's affected. So just be cautious of that, but also enjoy your life. Even if something is concerning you, just know that you can always walk away from something that concerns you, and you can always go towards something better, because the last thing I would want for anyone is for someone to join an organization that they're not sure about and then they feel like they're trapped. You know, that feeling of being trapped is a lie. You can always walk away from something. And sometimes the best way to get away from something, what I've had to do, is I just go away for the weekend. You know, I take a little mini vacation. Or maybe I take a day trip somewhere and it's by myself and I just really need to sort through some things. You know, kind of take a personal retreat and really evaluate your life. Sometimes we need to do that, and I think everyone should do that once or twice a year, because it really puts everything into perspective. So if that can help you, that's great. I strongly encourage you to do that, and just know that your life has value, and your career has value, your workers' rights has value, and just know that everything is there for a reason and for a purpose, but also know when to walk away from something that does not help you fulfill your purpose and your destiny in your life. So until next time, I pray that you're happy, healthy, and whole, that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.